From Illinois Public Media, this is the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey. On August 13th, 2021, a fire started in a coal mine in Franklin County in southern Illinois. After 10 minutes, as the fire was still going, federal regulations say managers should have evacuated their people. Instead, government prosecutors say managers kept people working underground for parts of 3 shifts. 5 years later, that has led to criminal federal charges for 4 men for both the failure to evacuate and for failing to notify the federal safety agency in charge of mines. Joining us now to talk more about this case is Molly Parker, who grew up in southern Illinois and has been reporting on the area for more than a decade. She's currently with Capital News Illinois, also an assistant professor of journalism at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Molly, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And I should say, we taped this conversation ahead of time, so no calls today, but please let me know what you think. Our address is talk@21stshow.org, talk@21stshow.org. All right, Molly, tell me a little bit more about the mine, or I guess it's more properly called a mining complex.
It is. It's actually a huge site. And I think it, at one time, at least not that long ago, was one of maybe the sixth largest coal mining complexes in the nation. And it's owned through subsidiaries of Foresight Mining, which is a big coal mining company headquartered in St. Louis. And it's in rural Franklin County, which is about an hour from Carbondale, where SIU is located, for those who are familiar with that area outside of Southern Illinois. And big coal mining region, even as a lot of coal companies have shuttered their mines, this is still an area where there is active mining and a lot of people are employed in that industry there. They had a fire there, like you said, in 2021, and they did not immediately notify workers. And then even after MSHA, the mine safety organization, was notified by a caller, sort of a tipster, not even by the company officials, that there were efforts to impede their monitoring of that fire. And, you know, that's what's resulted in these indictments recently. Even though it's 5 years later, it took some time to get here, but they've indicted 5 people in total, 4 recently, and there was one other who was already was indicted and found guilty in this case. So these four additional ones are pending. They're set to be in court again on Thursday.
So take me through the sort of tick-tock of what you understand, based on government documents here, to have happened, right? I understand they're underground. They're using cutting torches to sort of take apart these steel girders that had collapsed, and then a fire starts. What happens next?
Yeah, I mean, from reading the indictment, what should have happened, it sounds like that the minute they knew there was a fire, within a really brief time period, within 10 minutes, that they should have notified federal regulators and evacuated the mine. But instead, they didn't. They downplayed it. They tried to put the fire out. Even when workers were finally evacuated, they didn't tell them why. They used a different reasoning. And, I have not personally talked to these managers and supervisors who were indicted, but it certainly, the narrative from the federal government's indictment, at least their side of this, makes it sound like instead of being forthright with workers and with federal regulators, that they tried to conceal what was going on, maybe tried to get the fire under control so that they didn't have to interrupt coal mining. And I'm sure, there's no question that, removing people from the mine and having to shut down operations when you've already called that many people into work costs money. So I don't personally know what their motivations are, but there's no question that shutting down a coal mine temporarily, once you've already got that many, workers there. I was told over the course of those 3 partial shifts that they kept men underground, men and women underground, that there's probably over 100 workers whose lives they put at risk. Nobody died in this incident. Thankfully, there were no tragedies, but I think that, reading the indictment, what's really scary about it is there could have been. And that is what, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District states. These were actions that directly put real lives at risk. Let alone, there were also a number of environmental problems from this, how they put out the fire with the firefighting foam contained PFAS, which are these forever chemicals that you hear people talk about. And there were alleged deaths of farm animals. and water contamination and all these things. But this indictment, this federal government hasn't gone after a lot of environmental damages from companies, particularly coal companies. And that's why I think this is actually kind of an extraordinary indictment. They're saying, even from the Trump administration, that what this coal company did and its managers and supervisors did was so egregious. And then in the aftermath of it, trying to manipulate the devices that were underground to monitor the.
Yeah, let's pause there because I think the politics of this is interesting, and you do write about that in your story. But maybe we can just talk a few more examples of when we say, it's not that they just didn't sort of pick up the phone or send a text or whatever you do to notify the Mine Safety and Health Administration of a fire, but they're actually signing required reports that say, oh, nothing hazardous to report at the start of our shift today. And then the next shift does that as well, allegedly, according to these documents. And I guess one of a miner is even directed to get rid of this sort of gas safety detector that they have to wear.
Yeah, again, that's my understanding that it really sounds like they're trying to downplay and do take different actions to um, not record what was actually going on and not be transparent about it, both again with workers and the federal government. I think even then, supervisors returned underground. I don't, it talks about, I don't know, all of this is in the story, but they were supposed to wear certain devices that, when you go underground that track where you are, and they were not utilizing those. Like they were purposefully trying to conceal their actions, at least according to the allegations in the indictment. Not only, not just acting out of ignorance. Again, this is the government's indictment and their side of things, that they weren't just, oh, I didn't know I had to make this notification in 10 minutes. We didn't know what we were supposed to do. We didn't understand. Sounds like the narrative they painted is that they actively and purposely concealed and manipulated devices and regulators and others who were trying to monitor the situation. Again, it doesn't describe their motivation, but one thing that leads you to think is that pulling miners out is expensive. But it could have been a serious tragedy underground.
And as you say, it's not just the lack of notification; it's also sort of misdirecting, allegedly, some of the people that were still there. Apparently, some of the people that were evacuated were told, "Oh, it's just a broken conveyor belt, not a fire."
Yeah, and I think workers really, later would express not knowing what was going on right away, right? Like imagine you're coming up and they do finally in your shift and you're told to go home and you're not really given the full picture. I mean, that is a really frightening thought to think, hey, I work for a company that could have potentially, allegedly been keeping me underground in a really dangerous situation. And even when I'm brought to the surface, isn't being forthright with me. That's a chilling thing to think about for a coal miner, because they do put their lives at risk going underground, and you rely on the companies you work for to at least adhere to basic laws of safety standards that are literally set out in the law. Like they had guidelines in place for what to do when there's a fire, right? Like that you call within 10 minutes, you evacuate the mine. I'm sure it's far more complicated than that, but these are things that these supervisors are required to know. So I think that reading the narrative in the indictments, it's really chilling to think that, um, it's a potential that profits were put over the value of people's lives and safety.
Well, as you say in the story, all four men are presumed innocent unless proven guilty. If convicted, they could face imprisonment. Let me remind listeners this is the 21st show. We're speaking with Molly Parker, who is a reporter with Capital News Illinois, also happens to be an assistant professor of journalism at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, who has been covering the case of four men, most recently, who have been indicted in a long series of cases that have stemmed from a fire that happened at the Franklin County Mining Complex back in 2021. We taped this conversation ahead of time, so no calls, but you can let us know what you thought. Talk at 21stshow.org. So you mentioned it's not just this one criminal case. There was one previous one a year ago. There have also been civil cases having to do with the environmental issues here. Can you talk a little bit, just briefly, about with the Illinois Attorney General, why he chose to get involved in this episode back in 2022?
Yeah, and the Illinois Attorney General, as well as some private landowners in the area, have filed lawsuits in Franklin County and state court, and are arguing more about the environmental aspects of what went on. And the thing I mentioned, the big thing that happened was the firefighting foam they used that, just required an enormous amount of this to put this fire out. It really ended up being a very large and prolonged underground fire. And that foam contains PFAS, which has been reported on nationally, some great reporting, investigative reporting around that topic. And those forever chemicals were pumped into the area and got into waterways that traveled pretty far away. I know there was one farmer who filed a lawsuit, and is pretty grueling details that he alleged that several of his farm animals were deceased. There have been people who have taken photographs of wildlife, fish, deer, and other animals that have like really large tumors on their bodies that people are, alleging are probably a result of this contamination. And I do want to say these are cases are pending, just like with the federal indictments. There is obviously some time before we'll know how this all shakes out. But a lot of people felt like not only were lives put at risk, again, that's what the main subject of the federal indictments are about, but also just widespread environmental problems that probably people will be living with for a very long time. I believe the Attorney General's office did reach some early agreements with the company to monitor, to do some things for containment. And I think that it will be important to see, whether they're doing those things and where it stands.
You mentioned the politics of coal mining earlier. Obviously, President Trump has made this a repeated point of his campaigns over the past decade or so, bringing, making coal great again. I guess making coal mining great again. So, I guess can you speak to that? There was you in your story. You note that there was some uncertainty about the future of the Mine Safety and Health Administration as part of the big Doge cost cutting efforts that happened last year.
I think that some of that has now quieted down, that they had talked about potentially eliminating some of those offices and then backed off of that. But I think things like this really show how important MSHA is in these oversight bodies, because this is a very conservative area. This is an area that is very much pro-Trump, that went and voted for Trump. Franklin County, has voted for Trump in both elections. There are a lot of people who believe in, coal and fossil fuels, that want to see, because of how the economy has been harmed here. There's no question that there are people who very much want to see and support Trump's energy policies. But that said, like, they don't want to be going underground for corporations that can, thumb their nose at safety laws, right? Like, so there is a line that people don't want to see crossed. And I even think it was interesting in talking to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, who's quoted in the article. We even discussed this about his decision to bring these charges, and he said this comes down to human lives. And you will see they didn't really take on the environmental impacts the state is, and some of the private landowners are dealing with that separately. But this, in their mind, really crossed such a line, the allegations, that they felt like they needed to pursue this criminally. And, I did ask, and I think it'll be interesting to see if anything changes. Of course, I didn't get any information about this, but, why wasn't the company itself indicted? Because I've asked, were these people taking their directions from anyone? You have to wonder why. These are people who probably know these workers by name, right? And maybe some of them are higher up the food chain, but some are working side by side with these men. And so it's really hard to understand, why they would want to put anybody's lives at risk. And so I have asked and wondered, is the company itself part of this? Where does that investigation been? Is more coming? And I was just told that the investigation is active, that they couldn't discuss anything along the lines of what else might be happening or not happening, as is a typical DOJ answer. But I do think that those are important questions as well. Like, how far up the chain did this go, and why were those directives being made?
That is an interesting question. Looking at the individuals who have been charged here, they range in age from 37 to 69 and apparently reside in Tennessee, Arizona, Kentucky, and one in Illinois. What's next for them in this case?
So they're going to be, at least some of these individuals are in federal court in Benton. That's where the Southern District has courthouses in Benton and East St. Louis, the most southern district, the most southern courthouses in Benton. And they are scheduled to appear on Thursday for just some preliminary hearings. And, as you know, sometimes these cases can go on a long time. sometimes they move quickly if they, accept plea deals and things can wrap up within a year, but sometimes cases, if someone chooses to have a jury trial, can drag on much, much longer. So I think that, we'll see as it goes, what the defendants put forward as their defense. I think it will be interesting to see if they do move toward a trial, what else would come out about this case. Again, about who are these individuals? Were they taking directions for someone? Was there someone at the top, even higher, that was calling the shots on this? Because it does seem like there was this coordinated effort, and when you have that many people coordinating something, it just, to me, raises some questions about who else might be responsible for what went on here.
Molly Parker is a reporter with Capital News Illinois. She also teaches young journalists as an assistant professor at Southern Illinois University. Molly, thank you so much for sharing your reporting with us today on the 21st Show.
Thank you.
More to come after a short break. This is the 21st Show. Stay with us.